Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
History is always political, right? No matter who writes it and when they write it, the story that you choose to tell contains values, it contains ways of looking at the past that makes it inherently political, right? And sometimes I hear this phrase, objective history. Well, I don't think there is such a thing. As well as there's no innocent fiction. Fiction is also very political. If you read a romance novel or watch a rom-com, there's certain ideas of how men and women or other people behave that is presented as normative, right? And that is inherently political. What right now is really upsetting to me is the ugly use of history by avoiding the complexities of actual history, right? So this binary, those our people were good, that other side was evil, and often this is based completely on fantasy.
How are stories told? How do they become? Where do these wisps of memory and words find the kernels to sprout from? In this conversation, historian and author Anirudh Kanisetti speaks to author Vikram Chandra about his beginnings and the methods he uses in his writing. This conversation was part of the Bangalore Literature Festival 2022.
Welcome, Vikram. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
So, I'd like to begin by telling you a little bit of how I actually started reading Vikram's work. By far, my favorite work of his is Red Earth, Pouring Rain, partially also because a reference to a Sangam period poem, which I am very interested in. Because I work on an art history encyclopedia, I was wondering about what modern Indian literature would look like, a literature that's profoundly grounded in Indian history and cultural ideas, but nevertheless speaks to modern sensibilities. And I was so struck by the way that Red Earth and Pouring Rain is framed with this monkey who's injured, who turns out to be the god Hanuman, who then is interacting with the protagonist and taking him through this series of wonderfully crafted stories. And I think that's a recurring theme of your work, Vikram, is that very often there are layers upon layers of stories that engage with so many different themes that take us through so many different places, both in time and in space. So to begin with, can you tell us a little bit about what inspires you? How do you decide to write about things like this?
I guess I'll start with specifics. So the time that I started writing Red Earth and Pouring Rain came from discovering a book in the library at Columbia University. So I was there at film school, and during that time was figuring out that I was not built for the film industry. So I used to spend a lot of time in the library. And on one of the top floors, which had a lot of books about Indian history, I looked up and saw two leather-bound books, 2 volumes that I brought down. And they turned out to be the autobiography, the translated autobiography of a British Indian soldier named Colonel James Skinner, Sikandar Skinner, who founded this very famous regiment called Skinner's Horse, which later became an Almond Regiment. And is it still around?
It's still around.
There. Yeah. It had been published, I think, in 18-something. The pages were really brittle, and I don't think it had been checked out for 60 years. So they let me take it home, and I started reading it. And Skinner's life was insane. It was incredible, right? So he's one of the first products of that encounter with the colonial powers in India and Indian culture and Indian people. His mother was a Rajput princess who was literally captured by his British father in a siege. And so he and his brothers and sisters had this very kind of mixed up life, right? Like between two worlds that in some ways really was damaging, right? Because they didn't belong on either side completely. So I went and then I read the whole 2 volumes, and obviously it wasn't going to be a film, right? Or at least in the way that I was going to imagine it, with epic battles. And, I pretty early knew that Hanuman and Ganesh were going to show up in the story. So that would need, I don't know, animation or something. So I decided I was going to write a novel about this. And precisely the same question came to me. How do you tell a story like this within the context of colonialism? And, when I start writing, these things come to me, and often this kind of rational analysis is post-game, right? Or somewhere in the middle. So I started writing it, and then the layers and stories within stories started appearing. One of the protagonists, Sanjay, is sitting, he's a monkey sitting at a typewriter. Again, animation maybe. And his stories seem to slide into other stories told by other people within the first story naturally. And so, yeah, it just like became that. And then looking back, I can also see that I used to listen to stories, especially from the Mahabharata when I was a kid, told to me by my mother and aunts before I could read. And that structure, those narratives are structured in essentially this way, right?
Exactly. That's what I find so striking is that I happened to be reading Red Earth Pouring at the same time I was reading the Katha Sarita Sagara, which is a beautiful compilation of 11th century stories. I think it was compiled in Kashmir.
Yeah, yeah.
And it has exactly the same structure as a lot of Vikram's work, where, of course, there is this inciting incident and there's this overall narrative frame. But within that, there will be somebody who's telling somebody else's story, and somebody within that story will probably be telling somebody else's story. And then it just becomes this very deeply, I don't really know how to describe it, but there is something so organic about it. It feels like you're entering this tapestry that leads you seamlessly to more and more tapestries.
Yeah.
I'm curious also, Vikram, about like how deeply you are inspired very clearly by Indian mythology, Indian history. First of all, more than what you've just told us. So you've told us in the context of Red Earth and Pouring Rain, but more generally also, how do you feel that history has inspired and informs your work? And how do you think about the way that history is being used in narratives today?
Well, I've been an avid reader of history again from childhood, right? And of course, also because when narrative history for the general reader is done well, it's really exciting, right? And you also know that these are real people, so there's a bite to it that fiction tries to get. But I mean, it's really powerful. It also informs my work, obviously with Red Earth and Pouring Rain, that if I'm going to write about Sikandar Skinner, then I need to understand the environment that he's born in, that he grows up in. So then I go into these research rabbit holes, as you know. How I met him was I discovered, I think on Twitter, that his book, Lords of the Deccan, was going to be published, and we have a common publisher. So I emailed her, and then he got in touch, and I started picking his brain. I started asking him questions, and he was kind enough to answer, right? And then I have to say that maybe I get obsessive about it because like these research rabbit holes lead you to one thing, and then in a footnote, you read something that sounds really interesting that you then start reading. And often I think I'm doing this as also an excuse to actually avoid doing the writing itself.
I can relate to that.
Yeah. And then it informs the whole thing, right? Even if I end up not using something that I discovered, I feel like it is like still there in a subterranean way. And then the other thing is, if you're going to write, for instance, about palace intrigue, what better way to get ideas than to read about actual palace intrigue, right? And so as a wellspring for fiction, as a resource, I think all of this is incredibly useful, right? And as to your question about the uses of history, history is always political, right? No matter who writes it and when they write it, the story that you choose to tell contains values, it contains ways of looking at the past that makes it inherently political, right? And sometimes I hear this phrase, objective history. Well, I don't think there is such a thing. As well as there's no innocent fiction. Fiction is also very political. If you read a romance novel or watch a rom-com, there's certain ideas of how men and women or other people behave that is presented as normative, right? And that is inherently political. What right now is really upsetting to me is the ugly use of history by avoiding the complexities of actual history, right? So this binary, those our people were good, that other side was evil. And often this is based completely on fantasy, right? Like not just like erroneous, like kind of resourceless historical information or like somebody makes an honest mistake. This is just like fantasy. Like WhatsApp University, I think, is pernicious and it's evil, right? And I think it's a way of causing this ugliness that we see in current day India, in the current day United States, where there's these polarized cultures, right? Which is, I think, teetering on the edge of violence, right? And I don't mean the violence that is already happening, but large scale violence edging toward genocide. My older daughter is in 9th grade in school, and I went, that first, like, come meet the teacher school. And her history teacher said, and I'm quoting almost literally, we don't teach history here, we teach how to do history. And that blew my mind, right? They're teaching historiography in ninth grade, which is, I think, a desperate need of our time.
I think that's a very important point. And this idea that historiography is something that needs to be engaged with only in academic context, I think is a very simplistic way of looking at it. Because I think that what your books actually do very well is engage with historiography from the perspective of narrative and storytelling. And I think that that's something that's very important because history does not need to be this abstract, dusty thing that lives only in archives. It is a living, breathing force around us in our politics, of course, but also in the very way that we see ourselves. And I think that's one thing that I particularly enjoy about both Red Earth, Pouring Rain, and Sacred Games is that these are people who are living in history, but they don't act like they're living in history. I think that's crucial, right? Very often when we think about people in the past, we don't think that we are living in the past. We don't think that we're living in history. But somebody is going to write a history of the 21st century 100 years from now. And they're going to look back. And what do you think they're going to think about us?
I mean, it's too harsh and ugly right now to think in that way, but they're going to think we are absolutely nuts, right? And somebody's going to write satire about this, right? And sometimes satire is the only way you have of dealing with this ugliness, right? Black humor.
I'd like to also discuss a little bit about your research methods. So, I mean, you have talked about going into rabbit holes, of course, but is there more than that? Is there a method to the madness? Because one thing that also strikes me, especially about Sacred Games, is that the way you write about lived spaces is with this like profound humanity. It's like you have lived in these homes, you've turned the pages on the calendars, like you've prayed at the altars almost. How do you go about researching? How do you, and I'm sure that a lot of these stories are also inspired by interactions you have with real people, just as history inspires you. How do real people, real spaces inform you and the way you write?
Dealing with specifics will help. So the way I started writing Sacred Games was that I was living in Bombay, and we've lived in Bombay for a long time, since the late 70s. But we saw the change in crime, right? So instead of a cottage industry kind of thing with local dadas in your neighborhood, it became a corporate affair, right? As in D Company, etc. Like really well organized, international. And the violence got uglier and uglier, right? So we had automatic weapons, gunfire in the streets of Bombay. That famous shootout at Lokhandwala happened like 3 blocks from my home. My father and I were driving back from town, and we heard the fire echoing off the buildings, right? My family's all in the film industry, and my brother-in-law, Vidhu Vinod Chopra, like many other people, got these calls from Dubai saying, you need to pay us this much money. And so Vinod and his family lived for a couple of years under armed police guard, right? And people that I knew were being shot at, right? And a couple of people got killed. So I was like, what the hell's happening here? So I asked my friend Hussain Zaidi, the crime journalist, I'm sure you know his work. Just tell me about what's going on and introduce me to anybody who can talk to me about this, right? So he introduced me to people on both sides, the cops, and on the other side, the intelligence agencies I found through somebody else. And, people like not in this world directly, but affected by it. And then I love being in offices and spaces because I'm always asking questions and writing down the answers. But, I interview a cop in a police station, and years later, when I'm trying to write a scene, I'll remember the fancy, expensive Keds he was wearing under the table, right? And that detail really can make a character, right? So this unconscious picking up, right? And, I like traveling. It's a way to avoid writing again, and taking photographs and listening to people. All of it, goes into this black pit, right? And which bubbles away. A friend of mine, another writer, and I call it the tar pit, after the tar pits in Los Angeles, right? So animals have fallen into these pits thousands of years ago, and suddenly a mammoth will float to the surface, right? So you put it all in there, and something happens, and then somebody comes out or an incident comes out.
What I find very striking is that so much of your writing seems to be inspired by trying not to write. But it seems to happen anyway.
Well, I mean, I don't know how it is for you. Writing is really hard and it's painful for a lot of us, right? I have met a couple of people who are happy writers, who love writing. I'm jealous of you, right? If you talk to many, many writers, you'll find this, I think, across the board, right? So being away from your desk and having an excuse to avoid it is actually fun. And then you're right, you come back and then you're actually in some sense eager, right, to create out of that.
So there's some stories about people that you've met that you cannot share, but are there any that you are willing to share?
Yeah, I mean, so the reason I can't share some of them is that I can't tell you about those without naming the people. And I still feel responsible to them, and some of them will actually put them in danger. Right? It sounds very thriller-like and all that stuff, but if you're investigating this world, I can tell you about my meeting with Arun Gowli. Right? He's G Company. He's one of the enemies of Dawood and so forth. So it's like, you go and you sit in these white plastic chairs, the universal white plastic chairs, and he lives in this chawl in Bombay near the mill area. And then one of his boys will come down and get you. So it's like a darbar of sorts, right? And you go up and like his kids were watching television, they're watching cricket, and there's a huge chandelier above it. And then when I was taken to meet him, there's a hall kind of thing with lots of mirrors on the wall. So again, like you see what I'm doing? It's like you get an idea of Bhai aesthetics, right? Yeah. And sense of place and all of that. And then the incredible thing about him was that years later, when Sacred Games was released, must have been like 12 years later, the Italian publishers had this clever idea of, we're not going to invite you to Italy to do PR. We're going to send a bunch of Italian journalists to Bombay and you can show them around, right? So my friend Hussein Zaidi and I took them to meet Arun Gowli, and he remembered me, which is, you can see now why somebody like that would be effective in the world that he lives in and how he would survive for so long and still survive.
I have one thing that really struck me was this tweet thread that I think the Paperclip or one of those handles put out the other day, which basically said that there's this tradition in the Mumbai crime world where when a job is offered, like a dish of pan is put out there, and whoever takes the pan is, whoever does the hit or so on is considered to be a particularly brave loyal
Supari.
soldier. Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
It's a Deccan courtly tradition that
Oh,
was
really?
also being done in the 11th,
Oh,
12th
wow.
century, where a king would offer pan or supari to a vassal, to a general, and it would be a reward and also a promise of future rewards for the work they're doing on the king's behalf. And what really strikes me is how similar the culture of Mumbai's dons seems to be to that of medieval Indian royal families. And it tells you a lot about the nature of I remember there's this little quote from Terry Pratchett where he says something on the lines of, if you were to only steal like a loaf of bread or a few coins, then you're a thief. But if you were to steal an entire continent, if you were to steal an entire kingdom, then you'd be acclaimed as a noble and a king and a lord.
Well, I mean, so we were just talking before this about like what is the word for some, for leaders using all religious traditions, right? All spiritual traditions. So the second time I went to see Gowli, and this was new on his terrace where we met him, you walk in and like it's a multi-religious tradition temple of sorts, right? So there's a big temple of Shiv with water flowing down, right? And then there's a picture of the Kaaba, and then there's a Christian cross. So the appeal is multi-religious, right? In exactly the way that rulers do. Right?
Fascinating. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, please share it with family and friends. You can also leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible are Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studios. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. Do follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to get regular updates on our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.